We have followed the story of Nibiru, the cataclysm that created our world, the Anunnaki coming to this planet and seeding humanity. We watched as humans took on a life of their own, became their own sovereign species, and developed across Mu and Atlantis. Whether these stories are true or not, we cannot say. However, the one place that all of the stories converge on each other has finally arrived: the Great Flood. Speaking of stories of ancient floods, most of us are undoubtedly familiar with the legend of Noah's Ark, a story in the Bible which describes how, at one point, an ark was built by Yahweh's chosen person, who in the Bible is known as Noah. However, the character of Noah was most definitely inspired by, based on, or perhaps even translated from, a much older tradition of flood myths that had been in circulation for thousands of years before the writings of Genesis. If we look to older writings, we find very similar stories written about in at least 3 different versions from the Mesopotamians alone. These older Noahs are known as Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, and Atrahasis respectively, each being a part of their own story, expanding upon one another and giving us a fuller picture of the whole narrative. In the 19th century, Assyriologist George Smith translated the first Babylonian account of the Great Flood, which sparked great interest in the topic, as many believed at the time that the text acted as external proof of the events of Genesis. Consequently, countless other so-called flood myths were unearthed and eventually translated. The most well-known of the flood myths of Mesopotamia are found in a few sources: the Akkadian Atrahasis epic from 1800 BC, the Eridu Genesis and the Sumerian king lists featuring Ziusudra as the last human king before the deluge, and finally, the Epic of Gilgamesh around 700 BC featuring Utnapishtim, which is largely regarded as being the closest in structure to our story of Noah in Genesis. Now, each tale is slightly different, given that each writer wanted to emphasize different aspects of the stories, but the overall narrative is mostly the same. In the Epic of Ziusudra, we begin with the creation of the world and humans, but the middle section is unfortunately lost, with the final fragment telling us that the gods have decided to destroy the world. In this version, we don't know why the flood is being sent, but Enki proceeds to warn Ziusudra to build an ark to help survive the deluge. In the later Epic of Gilgamesh, we learn that the Anunna Enlil sent the storms because humans had become too noisy, which could be speaking to humanity growing out of control. In this rendition of the tale, the Noah character, Utnapishtim, is then tasked by Enki to abandon his worldly possessions and create a giant ship to be called a preserver of life. It's very interesting then to see how much earlier established myths and even gods were incorporated into the narrative of the Old Testament under the guise of Yahweh or Adonai. In each of the ancient tellings, the ark builder was tasked with bringing his wife, family, and relatives along with the craftsmen of his village, baby animals, and grains, because a great flood was coming and would wipe out all of the life that was not on the ship. What's particularly interesting to us concerning this flood myth is that a great deal of historical and geological information shows us that this was an actual event which possibly took place between roughly 13,000 and 8,000 years ago, when the ice caps rapidly began to melt and flood the earth, wiping out a great deal of life and drastically changing the landscape. We can actually see this in our history today. Even a quote from Live Science states, "About 13,000 years ago, more than 3/4 of the large Ice Age animals, including woolly mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed tigers, and giant bears, died out. Scientists have debated for years over the cause of the extinction, with both of the major hypotheses, human overhunting and climate change, being insufficient to account for the mega die-off." That said, there is still considerable debate over when a deluge event occurred. Excavations in Iraq have revealed evidence of localized flooding at Shuruppak and various other Sumerian cities. A lot of other Sumerian cities display evidence of flooding on a large scale, but they are all from different periods. Modern consensus argues that flooding in the wake of the last glacial maximum are what inspired the ancient flood myths around the world, with the geography of Mesopotamia being drastically changed by the filling of the Persian Gulf after seawaters rose following the last glacial period. Some authors have even postulated that stories of a great cataclysm were ancient cultures' ways of explaining the early Bronze Age collapse and transitioned to more urbanized societies around 2900 BC. If these texts and stories are to be believed, this was potentially the event which wiped out all of the slave humans who, up till this point, according to Sitchin, had still been mining gold or slaving away at other tasks which the Anunnaki commanded. It was during this shift that the Anunnaki retreated from their earthly settlements, with Enki's last act being to support humanity and help us to survive the flood and shift in consciousness so that we could resettle and begin inhabiting the earth, this time without being isolated to any particular area, free to roam and inhabit the earth as we desired. It is believed that about 6,000 years later, they delivered information and wisdom of their existence to humanity through a messenger, feeding ancient Sumer with knowledge of their species and human origins. Curiously, the legend of a massive flood is actually not exclusive to Middle Eastern mythologies, but in fact is written about all over the world in countless different ideologies and cultures. In China, we see a story of a great flood that supposedly lasted for 2 generations, wiping out everyone save for those who moved to live in the mountains. In Central and South America, there are a number of ancient myths of floods wiping out almost all of the people, save for a scarce few who repopulate the earth. And as we looked at, there are even several stories across Mesopotamia, which all share a similar common thread. We actually don't have enough time in this singular video to explore all of the flood myths of the world, because we would probably be here for hours just on that one topic alone. Generally, in most of the flood stories, it is the gods or a specific god who brings the flood to wipe out humanity, either to start over or because we have displeased them somehow. For those interested in really diving into the various accounts, however, Graham Hancock has explored the world flood myths to an exceptional detail in his book, Fingerprints of the Gods, which again, we highly recommend reading. And speaking to this, there is an even more prevalent theory that brings all of these stories together and describes similar global events in history when the ice caps melted and the water rose tremendously, wiping out all, or most, of life. Geologists agree that by 8000 BC, the Great Wisconsin and Worm ice caps had retreated. The Ice Age was over. It has been postulated that the deluge myth in North America may be based on a sudden rise in sea levels caused by the rapid draining of prehistoric Lake Agassiz at the end of the last ice age about 8,400 years ago. However, the 7,000 years prior to that date had witnessed climactic and geological turbulence on a scale that was almost unimaginable. The few scattered traces of surviving humans must have led lives of constant terror and confusion, with periods of time filled with violent floods and climatic changes. The bulk of the animal extinctions took place between 11,000 and 9,000 BC, when there were violent and unexplained fluctuations of climate, which geologist John Imbrie has called a climatic revolution. Now, there is a very interesting theory about exactly how this whole thing took place and what it means for us today. To share this theory, we've borrowed a clip from our friends at Gaia from one of our favorite series, Ancient Civilizations, featuring Graham Hancock, Greg Braden, and a ton of other experts as they help to decipher the clues of the ancient past. What's especially remarkable about this theory is that it aligns very well with the story of Atlantis and an absolutely massive shift of ages.
Let's first of all consider the world during the Ice Age. Everybody's heard of the Ice Age. What was the Ice Age? The last Ice Age set in about 125,000 years ago. And it saw the buildup of giant ice caps, primarily on top of North America and on top of Northern Europe. Exactly why the Ice Age happened is still a subject that scientists argue about. But it's not in dispute that an ice cap 2 miles deep sat on top of North America and a huge area of Northern Europe, that same 2 mile deep ice cap. It reaches its maximum extent about 21,000 years ago. The temperatures are warming almost actually to modern levels, and the ice is beginning to disappear. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, really sudden, literally overnight, everything changes, and the Earth is plunged back into a massive deep freeze. This is a time of huge extinction of species are wiped out. The new evidence that is providing coherent sense to this is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. and it has been put forward by a large group of mainstream credentialed scientists. And what they've said is that they have found evidence which suggests the Earth was hit by several fragments of a comet. For a long time, the comet was out there. It was probably a very spectacular visual presence, but it wasn't hitting the Earth. But 12,800 years ago, by which time that comet had begun to fragment, had broken up into lots of fragments. And the estimates are that 4 of those fragments, 4 large fragments, hit the North American ice cap. It's literally beyond imagination. That instant of impact would have created so much heat that it would have melted large areas of the North American ice cap and sent the water flooding south. Then within a matter of days or weeks of that release of water, the freezing temperature has begun, and there's no more release of water. The world goes dry at that point and into a very deep, dark, frozen period accompanied by animal extinctions. The Younger Dryas lasts for 1,200 years. It lasts from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. And then something else really weird happens. The Earth's been in a deep freeze. Suddenly, 11,600 years ago, you get a second massive pulse of meltwater into the world ocean. One very strong suggestion is that the Earth intersected again with the debris stream of the same comet, and that there were further impacts 11,600 years ago. But those impacts were not on ice. Those impacts were entirely oceanic. You get big comet impacts in an ocean, and what you're going to get, as well as extraordinary tidal waves, what you're going to get is a massive amount of water vapor thrown up into the upper atmosphere. And that water vapor creates a greenhouse effect, which accounts for the very radical warming of the Earth. It has to be rather intriguing that that's the exact date, 11,600 years ago, that Göbekli Tepe is founded. And it has to be even more intriguing that 11,600 years ago is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction and disappearance beneath the flood of the ocean of the lost civilization of Atlantis.
This hypothesis is further backed up by an independent study featuring over 20 authors, which finds evidence for meteor or comet impacts on 4 different continents: North America, South America, Europe, and Western Asia, from about 12,800 years ago, in the form of nanodiamonds, spherules, and melt glass consistent with meteor impact. Randall Carlson is a PhD who incorporated the dating of Göbekli Tepe with geological evidence which suggests global flooding. He wrote that if an impact actually hit and there was a cataclysm, you could easily see how an effect of that magnitude would destabilize the Earth for perhaps 1,000 years or so. It's after this window of time that the Younger Dryas geological records shows an abrupt change in climate that we date Göbekli Tepe. But you see, this is not where the expedition ends in the search for answers about the Great Flood, as Graham Hancock has also put forward even more information in his most recent book, America Before. His new work focused on various kinds of evidence from the Americas, mostly from the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi River Valley and exploring the sacred geometry of the Amazonia, bringing to light some connections that seem to indicate that the occupation of the Americas was much earlier than is currently thought, and even appears to share some common concepts in ideology to that of the ancient Egyptians. Now, before we go any further, we should point out that the occupation and colonization of the Americas is a hugely controversial topic and has been described as one of the most agitated, fierce, and fruitless debates in modern archaeology. In fact, there are sites such as the Bluefish Caves and the Old Crow Flats which demonstrate human habitation in the Americas thousands of years before previously thought, and thus were met with fierce scrutiny. So it's no surprise that Hancock's work is often met with instant rejection. Now, Graham theorizes that a precursor civilization, which he argues were found in the Americas, were wiped out by global flooding, and the survivors of which helped to seed later mythological stories. This idea is made even more interesting by the evidence of dramatic sea level rises during or just before the Younger Dryas. In a nutshell, around 12,900 years ago, the world was warming up from the last glacial maximum, and becoming increasingly habitable when a comet entered our atmosphere and broke into several major fragments, many of which impacted the North American ice sheets. The tremendous impact of this comet hitting the Earth would have caused a few key things to happen. First, we would have seen a large amount of freshwater flooding into the lower coastal lands and entering the oceans, disrupting the natural ocean currents and raising the sea levels. Second, we would have a tremendous amount of steam shooting into the atmosphere, along with smoke from any fragments that didn't land in ice, and starting fires upon impact. All of this together would block out the sun for a very long time, and this causes a sudden drop in Earth's temperatures. This is exactly what we see happen by climate graphs of that time period. This rapid drop, followed by 1,000 years later, the rising of Earth's climate. To date, no scientific or geological hypothesis comes close to answering the mystery of what caused the spike closer than the comet impact hypothesis. Graham even suggested that if this were to have happened, it's possible that parts of the giant ice sheets, these massive glaciers, could have broken off from the main mass and slid across the Earth slowly. If this was to happen, it would have destroyed anything that it slid over, ultimately leaving us with no record or even ruin of any civilization that might have been there before. Now, this is where things get very interesting, because while things line up very well with the impact hypothesis, there's also evidence that in the last 1,000 years leading up to this event, we also see a sudden shift in sea levels caused by something called meltwater pulses, where sea levels could rise up to 25 meters over the course of about 400 years. This long, slow, and gradual event would have definitely brought people more inland for sure, but it would have taken some time to happen. The key difference here is that with the Younger Dryas ice sheet, we are seeing a sudden drop of temperatures in a very short amount of time in contrast. Seriously, today we are worried about a climate change of only a few degrees, but based on data from the Greenland ice sheet, the Younger Dryas period dropped about 4 to 10 degrees Celsius in the space of a few decades. There are alternative theories. However, the presence of the nanodiamonds and impact sites really seem to indicate that the comet is the most likely outcome. Other theories include ideas such as the Earth being hit by a solar flare, causing the ice sheets to begin melting, which still disrupted the ocean currents and subsequently caused the temperatures to drop as a result. And along with this, there's another theory that suggests mega meltwater avalanches that could be generated on the surface of a continental ice sheet and produce fast-moving waves of water nearly 100 meters high, traveling at 900 kilometers an hour, crashing into the world and destroying everything in its path. Again, these are all theories, so make sure you do your own research if you really want to go down that rabbit hole. Ultimately, all of these ideas, along with all of the data that we have from the Younger Dryas period, suggests that there was massive flooding and definitely would have been experienced by humans living at that time as catastrophic. Now, since research into all of this is still ongoing, there are still many mysteries to be revealed about this event. Naturally, with sea levels rising, the lower coastal lands are the first to be submerged, and anyone living and hunting there would have been submerged with it, similar to how Doggerland was submerged around 6,200 BC in Europe. Any humans who survived such cataclysmic events would have had it ingrained in their cultural memory that would have been passed through oral tradition into later civilizations. If this event really happened, it most certainly would have contributed to the mass extinction events that we see in history, and in extent, paved the way for the host of flood myths on every continent. And the last thing I'd like to speak on concerning the Younger Dryas impact is this. Generally speaking, the Younger Dryas impact is believed to have taken place about 12,800 years ago, which, returning to this chart, shows us when we see this sudden and sharp drop in global climate. However, there's very little conversation about what this other spike is, known geologically as the Bowling-Allerod period, which takes place just before. It's true that when we look at the last 1,000 years before the Younger Dryas, we see phenomenal climate changes as well, but there is very little evidence about what caused it, and most theories about how this could have been caused are problematic or inconclusive. The standing theory at the moment is that warm ocean currents deep in the North Atlantic abruptly released into the colder water above it, warming the waters and causing ice sheets to break off from the glaciers. While this is the prevalent theory, many others simply remark that it's just climate change, which seems to be another way of saying, well, we don't quite know for sure. Yet, if this is just a result of natural climate cycles, then that certainly brings about a much different perspective on climate change today. So that said, we have a few ideas about this on our own, because to us, this looks like a connected event. It looks like the Earth may have been going through some natural warming on its own, but that something caused temperatures to spike up and then suddenly drop. This may indicate that the comet impact is a little bit older than believed, that the first spike was actually the comet impact, and then the drop was the result of enough meltwater flooding the oceans for so long that it disrupted the ocean currents, and we see the temperatures go down as we discussed. Another possibility is that the first spike was the solar flare that we explored previously, which may have triggered a radical lifting of the Earth's temperatures, causing the ice to melt, flooding the oceans and disrupting the currents. If this is true, then perhaps a comet is not necessary in the equation. However, it's worth mentioning that the nanodiamonds seem to indicate there was a comet in Earth's recent history. It's possible that there are other causes of such a spike too. If we look to ancient India, we find stories of the Astra or the Brahmastra superweapons that sound a lot like nuclear explosions. What's more interesting is that we actually find evidence of ancient nuclear weapons use, or at least evidence that seems to suggest that the stories are more than just myths and legends. However, before we can explore and discuss these superweapons or where they fit into our ancient past, we must return to the subject of Göbekli Tepe. This site is compelling archaeological evidence that now dates human civilization back to nearly 12,000 years ago, around roughly 9,000 BCE. What puzzles archaeologists and historians alike was the previous assumption that stratified and complex civilizations did not emerge until around the time of Sumer, about 7,000 years ago. Until then, all we have evidence of in the timeline are semi-nomadic pastoralists who would follow hunted game around seasonally, perhaps occasionally using tools. Instances of monumental architecture are extremely rare, even though we have cases such as Cahokia in the Mississippi River Valley and a supposed city of hunter-gatherers. The general consensus is a distinct lack of the social organization required to build and maintain complex ritual sites. Even more interestingly, the timeline arguably lines up with a certain theory about the date of the construction of the Sphinx in ancient Egypt. Robert Schoch is responsible for identifying what he believes are wear patterns on the Sphinx that he has labeled as water erosion. But there were no great storms in ancient Egypt 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But if you go back 12,000 years ago, there was heavy rainfall in that region, where in the Holocene, the region was much greener and wetter than it is now. Now, the Sphinx erosion theory was met with great skepticism. Dr. Zahi Hawass, head of the Egyptian Board of Antiquities, said at the time, "Of course it is not possible for one reason. No single artifact, no single inscription or pottery or anything has been found until now in any place to predate the Egyptian civilization more than 5,000 years ago." This was a common belief back then, since the earliest signs of megalithic construction were only 5,000 years old. But the discovery and dating of Göbekli Tepe proves that structures were being built around 12,000 years ago in one form or another. While a lot of work has been done to try and disprove the Sphinx water theory, such as limestone analysis and contextual orientation, what if there really was something even more ancient about the Sphinx? The Sphinx has fascinated people since Cleopatra's times. There are inscriptions from as far back as Ptolemaic Egypt of excavations unearthing the Sphinx in the search for hidden passages. And even today, the mystery of the Sphinx persists. We have no idea what it is, what it's for, and there is nothing we have found that's like the Sphinx at Giza. Who built it? Why? How? Mainstream academics believe it was built in the time of Khafre, based on the likeness of the head and similarity of the temple of the Sphinx, but other anomalies persist. The most basic mystery regarding the Sphinx is how it's missing from the Egyptian records. Egyptians loved to write hieroglyphs. We have writings talking about the purchasing of materials and construction of pyramids, divorce records. There's even a record about how one day there was a woman disgruntled by a piece of bread who tried to fight the traitor. Seriously, meticulous records, including records for all of the temples. Yet no records exist from ancient Egypt about the building of the Sphinx. They just don't exist. Not a single word about it in the written records. One thing we do know from an inscription on the ancient Egyptian artifact, the Dream Speller, is that the pharaoh Khafre, who today many believe built the Sphinx, claims that he himself discovered the Sphinx buried in the sand and had his temple built around it. Not only that, but the Sphinx also lines up with the sun for the spring equinox, and the constellation housing the sun circa 5,000 years ago is Taurus. But 9,000 BC, or 11,000 years ago, we see Leo in the sky, which may be another clue as to when the Sphinx was actually built. Despite the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, Robert Schoch's erosion hypothesis, and the constellation alignment, not to mention with the Sphinx's construction missing from the records, many modern scientists remain skeptical and critical of these arguments. While we will admit If it was just one anomaly, maybe it would seem like a pretty crazy idea. But when you put all of the anomalies together, they do seem to add up. All of the evidence we have explored was known about before Göbekli Tepe was discovered, but most scientists argued that it was preposterous since no other megalithic sites were made this far back. But thanks to the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, the idea that the Sphinx is older than we thought is starting to be thought about more often. The construction of Göbekli Tepe would then be attributed to survivors of the catastrophe who passed on their advanced knowledge to human tribes set back from the massive natural disaster. This is especially made curious by the legendary carvings of the handbags of the gods. You see, all over the world we find these images of gods holding what looks like a bag, and there is a carving from Göbekli Tepe featured on Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Pillar, dating nearly to 9000 BCE, which shows a similar handbag-like image. It has left many to ponder their connection, and some even believe that the handbag is a sign of the gods bestowing the seeds of knowledge of civilization to humanity. What's more amazing is that Göbekli Tepe is located at the south of Turkey, inside of the Fertile Crescent, the place where agriculture is believed to have been invented 10,000 years ago. Could those handbags be a clue to bridging the gap between a lost civilization and the world we have today? Göbekli Tepe raises a lot of questions to the established history and archaeology of the time. The Great Extinction, evidence of flooding, great climate change, and structures way ahead of their time all seem to be pointing to a single earth-shaking event around 12,000 years ago. And its time of origin lines up with many significant events and mysteries present in our timeline so far. For many scholars, the uncovering of this 12,000-year-old structure corroborated theories and hypotheses that were once considered fringe or conspiratorial. Now, looking at our story regarding the fall of Atlantis and the influence of these other beings in the Mesopotamian accounts, it appears that countless cultures have been influenced by these Near Eastern schools of thought, from the Persians to the Greeks. And even much later, it appears as though the Judeo-Christian religions all seem to stem from each other like branches of a tree. But what about the people across the rest of the world? In this historical theory, it suggests that there were still civilizations existing elsewhere on the earth at the time of the fall, because when the inhabitants of Mu left their home, not all of them went to Atlantis. Some moved to the continents we call the Americas, and others went to Asia. This would make sense considering Mu would have been directly between those two in the Pacific Ocean. With this idea, we see this theory begin to explain how different spiritualities developed in different regions of the world. The Lemurians who did not migrate to Atlantis would not have had the same experiences that the Atlanteans did with the fall. And if the stories are true, neither would they have become more left-brain thinkers. And so after the fall, their spiritualities would have developed based on their environments and any supportive influence from those who made it through with their memories intact. When we observe the world's religions today, there are really three main forms that we can identify. Firstly, we have the Western faiths, which are generally the Abrahamic ones, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but which relate with the Greek, Persian, and Egyptian mystery schools from thousands of years prior. Next, we have the Eastern spiritualities like Taoism, Buddhism, Shinto, and so on, which are more to do with connecting with the spirit of nature or going deep within yourself to cultivate inner peace and stillness. Generally, these paths are less seen as religions, but ways of life and traditions to create harmony in one's life. The last faith group are the indigenous spiritualities, which are usually shamanic and animistic in nature, and are often developed around connecting with the spirit of the planet and nature in an intimate relationship to aid in spiritual, emotional, and even physical healing. Now, we understand that there is an incredibly massive number of spiritualities on this planet, and I'm not trying to oversimplify or generalize the diversity here. For so many of these faiths are unique unto themselves and beautiful in what they are and represent. Nevertheless, we can see this pattern of location and influence across time in how these different faith groups emerged, bringing us to where we are today. It would make sense that the Sumerian mythologies and subsequent Abrahamic faiths are concerned with the stories of the gods from the past so much, especially if there were enlightened beings who provided them with these stories in the first place. All of this really goes to show that these world religions are fundamentally connected with each other and a part of a much bigger story. Spiritual value can often be found in any faith if we look for it, and it's not appropriate to claim that only one religion or spirituality is specifically better or worse than another. Well, unless its core tenets are like, hurt others, take advantage of people, or kill people you don't like. Rather, today we simply must learn that we are all connected, all a part of the same family, and that we shouldn't demonize each other for our various beliefs, but hold a space of love and compassion for each other and what we believe, even if we disagree. Ultimately, this is a story about a young species who is struggling to find itself. We are learning the nature about who we are and recognizing that there might be a lot more to our origins than what we have been led to believe so far. And, as fate would have it, there was an event that took place in history that dramatically changed the course of our history and played a pivotal role in something taking place that shaped our world to be what it is today. If you want to continue this journey and explore more about Atlantis and other sacred sites, follow the link in the description and you can stream 2 full seasons of the Gaia original series, Ancient Civilizations, for free. See you next time. After the Great Flood, it was a long time until the emergence of what today we know as the first civilization. As if out of nowhere, the Sumerians came into existence, and from there, the Egyptians followed shortly thereafter. Over the preceding several thousand years, human civilization would change and evolve, all looking back and honoring the gods that started it all. How did we go from Atlantis to the world we have today? Find out on the next episode of the Sumerian epic, The Rebirth of Culture.